Well, we turn now to our first Christian author of our course together, St. Augustine, and his work, The Confessions. There are two foundational cities, so to speak, to Western civilization. That is to say, two cities that represent the two pillars of what become Western civilization as we know it. Athens, which represents the life of reason, the life of philosophy, and Jerusalem, which represents the life of faith. And the big question is, what is the relationship between Athens and Jerusalem? What is the relationship between faith and reason? Are they just two things that run on parallel tracks, never intersect? Are they synonyms for the same thing? Are they two different spokes that lead to the same hub? What is the relationship between faith and reason? Keep that question in mind as you read Augustine's Confessions. The Confessions itself is a groundbreaking work. It was the second most read book in all of Christendom, all the way into the 16th century, second only to the Bible itself. A very popular work, widely read, extremely influential, and groundbreaking. The genre of the Confessions is a very interesting question. It is the world's first autobiography. Prior to the Confessions, authors did have autobiographical sections and letters that they wrote, but the first full-fledged autobiography is the Confessions. Now, of course, it's a rather unusual autobiography because it is written not to us, the human reader. Rather, it is addressed to God, and the reader merely overhears. So we're eavesdropping on a man who's talking to God. And because he's talking to God, this autobiography is also a prayer. Not to give away the ending, but the very last line or very last word of the Confessions is Amen. So Augustine is writing this prayer that takes the form of an autobiography. And the prayer is not a one-way conversation. There actually is kind of a back and forth between Augustine and God in the Confessions. The trick, though, is that God's voice cannot be heard. But that doesn't mean that he's not answering back. Did you notice that Augustine seems to be changing his mind as he goes along having these conversations? It's not that he's confused and he should have just edited better. His opinion is evolving in conversation with God. Think of it this way. The Confessions is like a Platonic dialogue that moves from opinion to knowledge, except you don't hear one of the interlocutors. You don't hear God's voice. So just as you eavesdrop in on a Platonic dialogue and get a sense of the conversation of the characters, you're eavesdropping here as well in the Confessions, except you are eavesdropping in on a phone conversation where you hear one person on the phone, but you can't hear the voice of the other person. But even though you can't hear the voice of the other person, you can still kind of tell what's going on. You can kind of tell what the other person on the other end of the line is saying, even though you can't hear his or her voice, by the way the person you can hear is reacting to it. That's the same kind of dynamic that's going on with the Confessions. So it is a very interesting work. The very first passage of the Confessions is perhaps one of its most famous. And so why don't we turn to that now? This is page 3 of our edition. The opening lines. Great art thou, O Lord, and greatly to be praised. Great is thy power, and of thy wisdom there is no number. And man desires to praise thee, He is but a tiny part of all that thou hast created. He bears about him his mortality, the evidence of his sinfulness, and the evidence that thou dost resist the proud. Yet this tiny part of all that thou hast created desires to praise thee. Thou dost so excite him that to praise thee is his joy. For thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. That's the famous line. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. For Augustine, we have a human nature that has been designed in such a way that it cannot be happy without God. It cannot be happy by attaining its deepest desire, which is union with God, union with ultimate truth. And every time we fall short of that, we are unsatisfied, we are restless, we are miserable. Our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And the Confessions is basically Augustine's memories of all the different ways in which he tried to find a substitute for God and failed miserably. I describe the first 5 chapters of the Confessions as sort of an overture for the work, because an overture in music gives you a little sampling of all the melodies that you're going to hear throughout the rest of the performance. And there's something similar going on with these first 5 chapters. In addition to this important theme of man's restless heart, he goes on and describes like really weird questions, or asks really weird questions. Grant me, O Lord, to know which is the soul's first movement toward thee, to implore thy aid or to utter its praise of thee, and whether it must know thee before it can implore. Questions of the relationship between knowledge and praise and imploring aid. What's going on here? It gets very confusing. What he's basically getting at is the difficulty of understanding God's presence. God is present to us, but how? He's not present the way this whiteboard is present in the room. I can't see God the way I can see a whiteboard. And yet I know he's present. He's present in an even higher way than a mere physical thing. How do we understand that? It seems like a kind of obvious question, but really, we don't really know the answer that quickly. Not even many Christians really think about these issues. So the idea of God's presence is a very important one that runs throughout the Confessions, and we need to keep our eye on it. It's after he finishes his overture that he goes into his autobiography, and he begins at the beginning. He starts with himself as an infant, which he says, of course, he can't remember, but he can kind of piece it together from his observations of other infants, as well as from what he has heard largely from women and their experiences with raising children. Did you think he was too harsh on infants? It's very easy to see or to think that he is vilifying babies, almost thinking of them as sort of spawn of the devil. That's not what he's up to. What he's drawing our attention to is the fact that from the very first moments of our life, we exhibit a kind of destructive behavior that is not fully rational, a kind of selfishness, a kind of meanness that isn't necessarily learned. It just seems to be part of us. And yet, why is it a part of us, or how is it a part of us? What Augustine is drawing our attention to with his portrayal of infancy is what in the Christian tradition is called original sin. It's called original sin because it's a sin that has to do with our origin. That is to say, we we are the descendants of Adam who have inherited the sin of Adam. Original sin is not a sin that we have personally committed. It is rather a kind of inherited spiritual birth defect that we are simply born with. It is not a part of our nature, strictly speaking, because our nature is good. Rather, it is a corruption of our nature that, unfortunately, we are stuck with. And that is what Augustine is getting at when he's talking about the behavior of infants. Like, for example, that scene where he says he sees baby number 1 being nursed, it's totally satisfied. Baby number 2 then gets nursed, and then baby number 1 sees this and freaks out, grows green with envy. Notice that even from a sort of Darwinist point of view, survival of the fittest, being concerned only about your self-preservation, even if that were your mentality, this baby's behavior is not entirely rational or reasonable. Why begrudge another creature food when you've already got enough for yourself? So what's going on here? Augustine says this is a sign that points to the enigma of original sin. Now, that doesn't mean the baby is committing sins itself. Personal sins can only happen when you know the difference between good and evil and you can exercise your free will. And for a lot of philosophers and theologians, that doesn't happen until you're about 7 years old. So he's not calling babies sinners, or at least creatures that are committing sins. He's calling babies, like all of us, creatures who are beset with original sin. Incidentally, this explains his attitude towards baptism. This is something that has to do with his boyhood. He was brought up in a Christian household, or at least his mother was Christian, but he was not baptized. And at the time, baptism, there were different practices for in the early church. In Rome and in other parts of Italy, infant baptism had been practiced from the earliest days that anyone could remember. Some people even say the practice of infant baptism goes as far back as the apostles themselves. So Italy had a very ancient, already by the 4th century, had an ancient custom or tradition of infant baptism. North Africa had a different tradition. Their idea was to defer baptism, let a kid grow up, hit adolescence, youth, young adulthood, and if he had any wild oats to sow, he should sow them now. Get it out of his system, let him calm down a little bit, then he can be baptized, made a full member of the church, and then start to live a straight and narrow life. Augustine is very critical of that point of view. He's not only critical of it spiritually, he's also critical of it because it has a very naive anthropology. It has a very naive view of man. To understand what he's getting at, think back to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. When you commit the same act over and over again, are you getting it out of your system, or are you more deeply ingraining it into your system? The idea of sowing your wild oats, having a few experiments, blah, 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 and then moving on as if nothing had ever happened, is naive. When you sow your wild oats, especially a lot, you are forming a habit. And you can't just pretend that that habit doesn't exist when you decide to live a more morally responsible life. You've now got baggage, and you can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. So Augustine is critical of this idea of just letting people sin and then they get it out of their system and then they can get grace. The analogy that he uses is if someone is sick, Do you wait until they're on death's door before you give them medicine? Or do you give them medicine as soon as the symptoms appear? Nip it in the bud. Don't let things get worse. Augustine and the entire early church with him believed that baptism was a sacrament that not only symbolized cleansing, but actually delivered what it symbolized. In other words, it really does cleanse. It cleanses you of the stain of original sin and brings with it saving grace. So it is medicine. Original sin is the disease, baptism is the cure. And so original sin starts at the moment of conception. We're born with original sin. Therefore, Augustine reasons, why not administer the medicine as soon as possible? So he is critical of his parents for delaying his baptism. They were going to give it to him as a boy when he got really, really sick and they thought he was going to die, so they didn't want him to die unsaved. But then he got better, so they thought, oh, well, we'll just delay the baptism. He says, no, you should have given it to me when I was an infant. Then at the very least, I would have had grace to combat some of the tendencies of original sin. Baptism does remove original sin, but some of its effects remain. And so baptism gives you the grace to fight those effects, to say no to evil. So he describes his infancy and our infancy as one that is affected by original sin. And then he describes his boyhood. He has now moved into the realm or the age where he can commit his own sins, and commit them he does. He describes himself as vain, as dishonest. He was so eager for victory that he would cheat, and lazy. He didn't like to learn. He had to learn, or his teachers would beat him ruthlessly, but he just really didn't want to learn. It's interesting how he reflects upon that moment or that chapter of his life. He is critical of himself for not learning more, even though the motives of his teachers for teaching him were every bit as corrupt as he was. For all he cared about was victory, all he cared about was being prominent in the playground. And his teachers were the same way in the faculty lounge. They were every bit as petty. They were every bit as conniving as he was. And the only reason why they taught him things like grammar was not because they were good, that they pointed you to the truth. It's because they would help him later in life advance his career. Isn't that a shocking idea, to think of education only in terms of success and career? The more things change, the more they stay the same. So the teachers had bad motives. And yet, even though they were teaching him for the wrong reason, he still should have accepted this as a providential thing and learned more from it. He's got a great line in Book 1 to this end. Page 13, this is Book 1, Chapter 12, Paragraph 19, bottom of the page. But you, O Lord, used for my good the error of those who urged me to study. But my own error, in that I had no will to learn, you used for my punishment, a punishment richly deserved by one so small a boy and so great a sinner. Thus you brought good for me out of those who did ill, and justly punished me for the ill I did myself. For so you have ordained it, and so it is, that every disorder of the soul is its own punishment. That's a great line. Every disorder of the soul is its own punishment. Think of Plato and the three parts of the soul. the unjust man living an unhappy life because there is no harmony in the three parts of his soul. You don't have to wait to get to hell to be punished. The pain of sin, the punishment of sin, begins right now. Sin is its own punishment. So Augustine is very critical of his own boyhood. He's very critical of himself, but he's also very critical of the society in which he is born. His teachers have just as many misguided goals as he does. His playmates are misguided, just like he is. You know, today we have this big debate, nature versus nurture. When someone is bad, is it the result of their own choices, or are they merely a product of their environment? And all we need to do is have social re-engineering, change the environment, and all these problems will go away. Today, most American liberals will say that nurture is the issue, whereas most American conservatives will say it's your own choices that are the decisive factor. Augustine says both. It is both. Society certainly compounds the problem and makes bad choices easy, but you are also responsible for your own decisions. You are responsible for your character. And if you make those bad decisions, harm your character, you have to own up to that. It's not either or, it's both. And so when he's critical of boyhood, he's actually critical of all society. He's got this great line, for the idling of boys they call play, the idling of men they call business. The same pettiness that you experienced in the playground, and do you remember how mean and petty the playground could be? That same pettiness is the same pettiness you will experience as an adult in the business world. Only the toys have changed, but the game is still the same, unfortunately. So Augustine is critical of his boyhood. He's critical of society, but he doesn't say that this is all just evil, that he was totally depraved as a kid. He ends book one in an interesting way. Last page, last paragraph. Yet, Lord, I should have owed thanks to you, my God, and the most excellent creator and ruler of the universe, even if it had been your will that I should not live beyond boyhood. For even then I lived, I felt. Even so early I had an instinct for the care of my own being, a trace in me of that most profound unity whence my being was derived. Just skipping down a bit. All these were the gifts of my God, for I did not give them to myself. All these were good, and all these were I. Interesting line. Therefore, he who made me is good, and he is my good. And in him I shall exult for all the good qualities that even as a boy I had. But in this lay my sin, that I sought pleasure, nobility, and truth, not in God, but in the beings he had created, myself and others. Thus, I fell into sorrow and confusion and error. Thanks be to thee, my joy and my glory and my hope and my God. Thanks be to thee for thy gifts. So notice what Augustine says. He does not say that seeking pleasure, nobility, and truth are bad. As a matter of fact, our human nature is constituted to seek pleasure and nobility and truth. The problem is that he was seeking them as a substitute for God. So, pleasure, nobility, and truth by themselves are good. But when you seek them without God, instead of finding pleasure, you find sorrow. Instead of finding nobility, you find confusion. Don't think just like intellectual confusion, think emotional confusion. You are your expectations are confounded, frustrated. And instead of seeking truth, you find error. But thanks be to thee, O God, my joy, my glory, and my hope, he says. And the word there for hope could also be translated as confidence. When you seek pleasure in God, you find joy. When you seek nobility in God, you find glory. When you seek truth in God, you find hope or confidence in the attainability of truth. So it's all about the right ordering of your desires. Pleasure, nobility, and truth. What do those three things remind you of? Do they not remind you of the three parts of the soul in Plato? Notice, Augustine is making a very similar point as Plato, that it's not that any of these desires are bad, they just need the right ordering. What Augustine adds to the conversation is that ordering needs to happen in God. God needs to be the ultimate goal, and then everything else will fall into place. And when God isn't that ultimate goal, everything falls apart. Keep your eye on the three parts of the soul in the Confessions. It turns out Augustine has read Plato, and he is benefiting from it. And this is also a good example of what a subtle writer he is. He doesn't beat you over the head saying, oh, look at me, I'm drawing from Plato right now. But he is. So keep your eye on that. He is a delightfully subtle writer. I forgot to mention one other thing about Book 1, and it is this. Did you notice our friend Virgil was given a shout out in Book 1? One of the things that Augustine had to do was read the Aeneid. And he falls in love with the story of Dido and Aeneas, interestingly, particularly empathizing with Dido, who kills herself tragically for love. And I draw your attention to that because it gives the impression that, the Confessions gives the impression that Augustine is down on Virgil. He says, what was I doing weeping for Dido when my own soul was dying and I was dry-eyed about it? So does this mean that Virgil is bad? Literature is bad? That's not exactly what he's saying. What he's drawing our attention to is his own misuse of Virgil. He doesn't actually accuse Virgil of writing immoral poetry. He reacts to it immorally. He reacts to it basically in a kind of an escapist way, which is very easy to do, is it not? There are people who just sort of get sucked into stories, become obsessed with movies or whatever, where their own lives are a complete train wreck. And so they're obsessed with all these fake stories, and their own real life story is a mess. That's the trap that he had fallen into. So another thing to keep your eye on is the way Augustine interacts with books. The Confessions is in many ways a book about books. There isn't a book in the Confessions that does not include a discussion of books. So in Book 1 we learned that Augustine was a vain, lazy, and dishonest boy. And in Book 2 we learn that he reaches adolescence and the hormones have kicked in. And Augustine becomes filled with lust and acts upon that lust. Notice, however, though, he does not again vilify sexual desire per se. Notice the way he describes it in the opening pages of Book 2. My one delight was to love and to be loved. But in this I did not keep the measure of mind to mind, which is the luminous line of friendship, but from the muddy concupiscence of the flesh and the hot imagination of puberty, Mists steamed up to becloud and darken my heart, so that I could not distinguish the white light of love from the fog of lust. Both love and lust boiled within me and swept my youthful immaturity over the precipice of evil desires to leave me half drowned in a whirlpool of abominable sins. Chilling imagery. Did you also notice there's an oblique reference to Scylla and Charybdis? Augustine is drawing from some of the other things that we have read together this semester. So it's not that love is the enemy, but it is the mixing of love and lust. It is the confusion of friendship and lust that causes a lot of these problems. And Augustine didn't need any help lusting. The hormones have kicked in. He's eager to engage in lustful activities. But he also goes on to say that friendship makes the matter much worse. Notice what he says just a couple pages later. I'm looking at Book 2, Chapter 3. This is page 28 of the Sheed edition. I realized none of this, went headlong on my course, so blinded that I was ashamed among other youths that my viciousness was less than theirs. I heard them boasting of their sexual exploits, and the viler the exploits, the louder the boasting. And I set about the same exploits not only for the pleasure of the act, but for the pleasure of the boasting. I'm sure this is a phenomenon that only existed in 4th century North Africa. Or is it? It's locker room talk. And the more vile the locker room talk, the more the talker is celebrated. So Augustine's peers did not make him do something bad, but they did encourage him. He gladly went along, and he wanted to do these sexual acts not only for the pleasure of it, but for the bragging rights. And he says when he didn't do anything, he lied and made up things to brag about. So messed up was he. And the reason why he cares so much about the opinion of his peers is that he has rejected the voice of God, which comes to him through his mother Monica, because his mother sees that he is leading a sinful life, and she's worried about this, and she tells him, don't. Try to be chaste, try to be pure. And he dismisses it as womanish advice. This is a machismo culture. What he does not realize is that this woman's voice is speaking the voice of God, that this is God's commandment that she is merely echoing. Augustine will later describe, at the end of Book 2, this phenomenon of friendship as friendship unfriendly, because it is not a very friendly form of friendship that pressures you to do bad things. And all of this is illustrated in the episode of the pear tree. Why does he choose that particular episode, I wonder? I mean, Augustine probably did dozens of dumb things as a teenager, as have we all, right? Think of all the dumb things we do, the pointless, meaningless things we have done as teenagers. Malicious things, vandalism, knocking over mailboxes or whatever. Of all the things that he did do, why does he choose this particular one? I don't know the answer to that, but I can say at least this much. It's a pear tree. So it's a sinful act that takes place in a garden by stealing a forbidden fruit. Sound familiar? This has an echo of the Garden of Eden. Augustine is sort of locating his own sinfulness within a broader narrative of sin and redemption. He's starting to understand himself, at least as the author, he's understanding himself through the lens of the Holy Bible. Anyway, coming back to the pear tree, he steals some pears. He and his dumb buddies hop a wall, sneak into some farmer's yard, and steal pears from his tree. Why? Was it because they actually needed the pears? No. Augustine explicitly denies this. He says, I had better pears at home in the fridge. We tasted these pears. They were actually nasty, and we ended up throwing them to the hogs. That's an interesting line too, isn't it? Throwing them to the hogs. That's what the prodigal son does when he flees his father and then has to get this really bad job after a famine. His job is to feed the hogs. Incidentally, that is the cover of our edition. This picture is not a picture of a shirtless Augustine. This is a picture of, or a painting of, the prodigal son. And if you look very closely in the background, you see these sort of dark, spooky figures. They're actually the hogs that the prodigal son had to feed. So he didn't do it for the pears. Why did he do it? He did it for the thrill. Because there is a special thrill in breaking the law. When you break the law and get away with it, you are demonstrating your independence from the law. You are demonstrating your power over the law. And that feels kind of good. Do you remember being a kid and you wanted a cookie and you said, Mom, can I have a cookie? And she said, no, it's only an hour before dinner. You'll ruin your appetite. And she turns her back and you steal that cookie. And it seems to taste really good. Why? Because when you steal that cookie, you demonstrate that you are not under your mother's thumb, that you are free. Well, here's the problem. When you rebel against God's law, you are also rebelling against the very source of your freedom. It is God who constituted you a free human being. And so when you rebel against his law, you are undercutting the very source of your freedom. And the more you do that, the less free you become. And the less free you become, the more susceptible you are to caring about the opinions of other people. The more susceptible you become to peer pressure. And that's exactly what happens to Augustine with the pear tree. He is pressured to do it. He's pressuring others. They're pressuring him. They're all doing this, and they're all making each other miserable. Do you remember middle school? Do you remember junior high? When you go from that kind of innocence of childhood to suddenly becoming hyper concerned about what everyone else is thinking about you and what the cool kids think about you? And do you remember what a living hell that was? This is a formula for misery. Notice how he describes it near the end of book 2. Here then, O God, is the memory still vivid in my mind. I would not have committed that theft alone. My pleasure in it was not what I stole, but that I stole. Yet I would not have enjoyed doing it. I would not have done it alone. O friendship unfriendly, unanalyzable attraction for the mind, greediness to do damage for the mere sport and jest of it, desire for someone's loss with no gain to oneself or vengeance to be satisfied. Someone cries, "Come on, let's do it," and we would be ashamed to be ashamed. Who can unravel that complex, twisted knottedness? It is unclean. I hate to think of it or look at it. Skipping down a few lines. I went away from thee, my God. In my youth I strayed too far from thy sustaining power, and I became to myself a barren land. Another way to translate that line Barren land is wasteland, because the imagery here is not of a land that had never been fertile, like a desert that only has a few cacti or something. The idea is of a land that was once fertile that has been polluted. It has been despoiled. It has been exploited. It has been ruined, wasted. What Augustine is getting at is this. Think of all of creation as fitting into this triangle. And it's a triangle because it's a hierarchy of goods. Lower goods at the bottom, higher goods at the top. Having lower goods and higher goods doesn't mean that the lower goods are not good. They are good. They're just not as good as a higher good. And what is above this triangle of all that exists? Augustine would say, God. God is not just simply the uppermost part of a triangle or pyramid of existence. God is the maker of the pyramid. God is the author of creation. So he is above his creation and he transcends his creation. And if God is above all that exists, what is below all that exists? Well, it's not the devil, actually, because the devil does exist. He was originally a good angel who has rendered himself evil, so he's at the very bottom of the totem pole, maybe like the very bottom of this blue line right here. What is purely below the pyramid? Well, quite literally, nothing. And Augustine's point is this. When you choose a direction to go to, you become more what is at the end of that journey. You become that towards which you tend. And so if you choose the higher goods over the lower goods, you go in this direction, and in a very real sense, you become more godlike. You become more authentically grounded in the freedom that God has given you. You become more free and more holy. And by becoming more holy, you become more like God himself. In a good way, you're not trying to steal godlikeness away from God, the way Adam and Eve tried to do, but you're moving in a godly direction. And the neat thing about this direction is that when you choose the higher goods over the lower, you not only get those higher goods, you get the lower goods as well. For example, the pleasure of drinking wine is a good. It is not evil, it is a good. But moderation is an even higher good. And when you choose moderation over the mere pleasure of drinking wine, you not only get that virtue of moderation, you also can enjoy the pleasure of the wine. Who enjoys a glass of wine more, an alcoholic or a moderate drinker? It's the moderate drinker who enjoys that glass of wine more, because the alcoholic who's so hell-bent on that glass of wine doesn't really enjoy that glass of wine because all he can think about is the next glass of wine. Whereas the moderate drinker can enjoy that glass of wine, have it with his meal. The meal is over. He doesn't spend the rest of the night obsessing about it. He's enjoyed it and moved on, and therefore enjoyed it better. So when you choose the higher over the lower, you not only get the higher, you get the lower as well. Conversely, when you choose the lower over the higher, instead of a win-win situation, it's a lose-lose. You not only have forsaken the higher, but there's a way in which you can't even enjoy the lower. Like the alcoholic who cannot really, truly, properly enjoy the glass of wine that now defines his very existence. And what is more, just as you become more godlike when you ascend, you become more like your destination when you descend as well. You become more nothingy Instead of adding to yourself, you subtract from yourself. You diminish yourself. You move towards the void, and you yourself become less. You become a wasteland. You know, there actually is a word for nothingy in our language. It's from the British word for zero or nothing, not. Naughty. Now, unfortunately, we've kind of ruined this word today. Naughty either has to do with Santa Claus or it has some kind of kinky connotations, which we needn't get into. But literally, think about what it means. It literally means nothingy. Something that is naughty, that is wicked, moves towards nothing. And it makes you nothing. It makes you not bigger, but smaller. Augustine stole pear trees and engaged in these sexual activities to be bigger, to look bigger in the eyes of his stupid friends. But it only made him smaller. It only made him a wasteland. It only made him nothing.